Sartre, Stalinism, and the Workers. This was originally published in Socialisme ou Barbarie in August 1953. Or in August 1953. In the spring of 1947, the Stalinist Party left the government. It was forced to by the revolt of workers who no longer would swallow its, quote, produce first, end quote, line, which brought with it more and more misery, and also by the fact that it no longer could continue playing its double game on the Indochina question. The year 1947 had been marked by great working-class struggles. The Stalinists spent the time readjusting their policies. Openly against the strikes when they began, the Stalinists later tried to curtail them from within, but the rapidly deepening rift between the Soviet Union and the United States and France's ultimate passage over to the American side obliged them to totally change their strategy and their tactics. The strikes of November to December 1947, when the general mobilization of the workers failed without the Stalinist parties for a single moment having clearly wanted, demanded, or organized it, marked the end of this painful period of readjustment. From then on, the goal of Stalinist policy in France was to sabotage the capitalist economy, especially in 1948 to 1949, to set the population against the government's Atlanticist policy, and eventually to get ready to disrupt the rear of the American front when war breaks out. The effectiveness of this policy is continually put into question by the inherent contradictions of Stalinism in general, and of its situation in France since 1947 in particular. The Stalinist Party gets its strength in the first place from the allegiance of the working class masses. Even if this allegiance is given at the start, in the long run it cannot be maintained, and still less expanded and intensified, unless the facts tend to justify such allegiance and do not continually go contrary to it. The facts in this case are, namely, Stalinist policy and its effects on the workers' situation. The Communist Party, therefore, must impose a line that serves the workers' immediate interests and has some discernible connection with their historical interests. Now, in its concrete actions, such a line does not necessarily coincide with a struggle that is anti-American before all else. It is easy to see that in most cases it differs from this struggle or is opposed to it. A strike in which wage demands are sacrificed to political imperatives rarely can expand or intensify the workers' allegiance to the Communist Party. Still less can it do so when the workers begin to wonder whether the Stalinist objectives or the means adopted to achieve these objectives really are their own. At the same time, the Stalinists are obliged to conduct a, quote, pacifist, end quote, policy that does not appeal to any class in particular and claims to be independent of their party goals. Both in phraseology and in real actions, however, their attempt to create a, quote, national front, end quote, tends to contradict their allegedly exclusive fidelity to the working class or to the exploited in general. Moreover, as part of the international Stalinist bureaucracy, the Parti Communiste Français, let's see how that's pronounced. I want to make sure that's not correctly.
Parti communiste franc, AIS. Parti communiste Parti communiste français. Parti communiste français.
Parti Communiste Français. Not only is, moreover, as part of the international Stalinist bureaucracy, the Parti Communiste Français, PCF, not only is not free to act in its little game as it wishes, but suffers the repercussions of what this bureaucracy does or what befalls it elsewhere. It has to make the best of changes in course that do not arise for it organically. It has to explain itself about Yugoslavia or Korea, Czechoslovakia or East Germany. We must point out another factor in these differences faced by the Stalinist bureaucracy. Taken one by one, errors committed by the Stalinist leadership are accidents. As frequent and repeated occurrences, however, they become the necessary evidence of its bureaucracy. Given the elements of this new situation, it takes no exceptional amount of perspicacity to foresee that the competency, cunning, and cynicism of the Stalinist leadership cannot prevent the working class from coming, quote, unstuck, end quote, from the PCF. And in fact, we wrote in the very first issue of this review, in March 1949, quote, "Since the strikes of November-December 1947, the French working class movement seems to be in a period of fragmentation and profound discouragement. A great number of workers still follow the main trade union federations, but they do so without confidence. The workers retreat from unions, from parties, from anything of an organized nature, and from, quote, politics, end quote, is a characteristic sign of the times. A series of advanced elements are driven by current events and by the politics of the traditional working class parties to stop and think about what is happening. But the great majority of the working class today remains spellbound by the negative aspects of its situation. It is aware not only that it cannot enter into a struggle against its political and trade union leaders, but even that it cannot enter into struggle independently of these leaders. It cannot struggle without calling upon them, or in any case without being, quote, headed up, end quote, by them, end quote. The form this, quote, coming unstuck, end quote, from the Communist Party has taken are well known. It is continually losing members, losing its newspaper subscribers. It is becoming less and less capable of mobilizing workers for political or even economic struggles. That the Communist Party and the Confédération Générale du Travail, CGT, General Confederation of Labor, have not lost votes in political or union elections since 1948 in no way contradicts this statement. The ties between the masses and bureaucratic organizations have been worn down to the thickness of a paper ballot. A choice in an election is always the choice of the lesser evil. The worker thinks that a collapse of the CGT would give the bosses a green light for an offensive, and the decaying state of the SFIO bars any alternative when it comes to political elections. In the all-out struggle between American imperialism and Russian imperialism, each profits from the other's contradictions and failures and tries to exploit them. The French bourgeoisie naturally rejoices each time the Communist Party suffers a setback among the workers. But newspapers in the West also denounce the exploitation of the workers in the East. The president of General Motors declares his solidarity with the strikers in Berlin. The director of the FBI laments the fate of Russian concentration camp prisoners. When Stalinists denounce the capitalist system, it appears less preposterous only because it is much more familiar. When the Stalinists denounce the capitalist system, it appears less preposterous only because it is much more familiar. It therefore was perfectly natural that Ridgway would come to Paris in May 1952, that the Stalinists would urge the population to come out and boo him, that the government would forbid the demonstration, that the workers would not come out, that Panay, strengthened by this new route of the CP, would arrest Duclos, that the Politburo would flounder around about what posture to adopt next, that the protest strike would be a failure, and that the bourgeois press would headline this as a, quote, workers' victory, end quote. History usually cannot be compared to a syllogism, but in this particular case there was nothing in the conclusion that was not already in the premises. Yet what was unexpected, or, if one prefers, irrational, came in the form of a series of articles by Sartre. Having exhausted knowledge like Faust, and wasted his youth like Caesar, Sartre became more and more obsessed by the demon of action. Like Plato, he resolved to leave the fields of Saint Germain for Sicily. Each time there was a Congress of Vienna. The first, quote, blurb, end quote, Sartre offered for the book of history through the intermediary of the RDR, don't know what that is, had been turned down 4 years earlier. Sartre drew a lesson from this experience forthwith. In politics, on the, quote, left, end quote, no less than on the, quote, right, end quote, what counts is not ideas but success. As he wrote so elegantly, quote, the true idea is an effective action, end quote. To fill the hive, VEL apostrophe D apostrophe HIV apostrophe, to gather 5 million votes at election time, that's what's true, that's what's effective. With such considerations in mind, Sartre set out to approach the Stalinists. A tall order if we recall the manner in which they had treated him till that time. But we also know that 9 times out of 10 an intellectual will not agree to leave his ivory tower unless he is assured of receiving a few swift kicks. He therefore went to the Peace Congress and heaped insults on his friend Camus, who was in the process of moving in the opposite direction. Passionately, he pointed out to him that they were both bourgeois, but that at least he, Sartre, quote, would make sure to pay for it, end quote. Severely, he summoned him to look in The Phenomenology of Mind, a book by Hegel, to find the reasons for the preeminence of Stalinism, and to come back in October. Thereafter things went rapidly downhill. The Communist Party called the workers to demonstrate against Ridgway, and the workers did not budge. The people's first elector was arrested, and the people did nothing. What had happened? Where did all this effectiveness go? The workers had been engaging in battle for 4 years now, every time they went on strike. But it was over vulgar little wage struggles, over economics, over the physico-chemical, over the molecule, over mere molecules. In short, over completely uninteresting things. But this time we were smack dab in the middle of history. We were up to our necks in praxis. A political demonstration organized by the Party of the Proletariat had run aground. The assistant manager of the party had gotten himself arrested by the cops amid the general indifference of proletarians. There was nothing dramatic about the workers losing a strike for a nickel more an hour. After all, Sartre, quote, will make sure to pay, end quote, for the steaks they won't be eating. But the workers not going on strike when Duclos is arrested merits 180 plus X pages in Le Temps Moderne. Having thus explained in his first article in July 1952 how it was natural for the Communist Party to carry out Soviet policy, and for the working class to follow it since the USSR is the birthplace of the revolution, Sartre, in his second article published 4 months later, then went to the heart of the matter when he gave his account of the meaning of the events that took place between the 28th of May and June 4th. What were these events? Nothing. Quote, nothing was expected, nothing happened, and on this, nothing. Mr. Pannekoek has built up his vainglory, end quote. And might we think ingenuously, that this also was the basis upon which Mr. Sartre constructed his articles? We must point out that Sartre abhors a vacuum. In Being in Nothingness, he interpreted sexual desires expressing man's anguish before holes. It is well known that a hole is nothing surrounded by something. Now, what was June 4th if not a hole in history? And as it turns out, this hole, this nothing, quote, frightened, end quote, him. Why? Because the working class repudiated the Communist Party? No, The working class did nothing of the sort, for one simple reason. Quote, on June 4th, there wasn't any working class, end quote. Those who are astonished that such a social cataclysm was not reported in the daily papers have not understood the subtlety of the game we are playing. There was no working class because the working class exists only inasmuch as it follows the Stalinist Party. Quote, it, the working class, cannot repudiate him, Duclos, without repudiating itself, end quote. And in this case, the working class no longer exists. There are only, quote, individuals, end quote. Quote, if the working class wants to detach itself from the party, it has only one means at its disposal, to crumble into dust, end quote. And this is so because, quote, the unity of the working class is its historical and noble relationship with the collectivity. Insofar as this relationship is realized by a synthetic act of unification, which, by necessity, is distinguished from the mass as pure action, is distinguished from passion, end quote. The, quote, pure action, end quote, is the party. Quote, the party is the very movement which unites the workers by carrying them along toward the seizure of power, end quote. All this, the reader says to himself, might be true and might be false. But what is to be done right now? Well, he has a choice. First, he can wait for, quote, one of the forthcoming issues of the Temps Moderne, end quote, where Sartre's final installment will be published. If, however, his generosity, his enthusiasm, and his impatience carry him toward immediate action and prevent him from waiting for the natural outcome of this ideological constipation, he can try to draw conclusions right now from what he has read. He will do so, however, at his own risk and peril, and he cannot be advised to be too prudent. If, for example, he has deduced from the foregoing that we must sign up as quickly as possible in this party, that is the, quote, workers' freedom, end quote, the, quote, pure action, end quote, that, quote, carries them along toward the seizure of power, end quote, he will show that he has not understood any of the wealth and complexity of Sartre's thought. For the latter is careful to indicate that while he does not agree with the Communist Party, though he does not say why, it is possible to conclude agreements with the Communist Party on precise and definite points. Which points? And who would be the second contracting party? And in the end, he hints that he wants, quote, a left that is independent and in liaison with the Communist Party, end quote. If this is the secret of the third article, it would be charitable to advise the reader that we would make better use of his money. If this is the secret of the third article, it would be charitable to advise the reader that he would make better use of his money if he bought some caramels instead, just as Sartre would make better use of his time if he went to bed. For the past 20 years, and in 4 corners of the world, people who were far more consistent than Sartre tried to lay the foundations for this independent left in liaison with the Communist Party. A fellow who had directed 2 revolutions, one of which was victorious, and who had created the first proletarian army, spent his last years, until the day the Stalinists assassinated him, trying to create an independent proletarian organization ready to make a unified front with the Communist Party. And to go from the tragic to the ridiculous, let us remember that the PSU also worked, quote, for an independent left in liaison with the Communist Party, end quote. Why have all these attempts run aground so pitifully one after another, whatever the strength or weakness of the Communist Party at a given moment? Why have Trotskyists always been murdered by Stalinists, and why has the PSU been doomed to alternate between being a well-tended garden of underground, quote, plants, end quote, and a desert of spineless cacti? The length of Mr. Martinet's nose, perhaps? And if it were longer, ought we to hope that Sartre's nose will make this little affair any better? For a, quote, independent left, end quote, really to take shape, lots of people and above all workers must join up. For them to join up with this independent left rather than with the Communist Party, there must be some reasons to set them against the Communist Party. And these must be basic fundamental reasons, not mere nuances or multiply split hairs. For today, problems are interconnected in such a fashion and people are smart enough that no half position will ever provide the basis for sufficient contrast or for the ideological foundations of a left independent of the Communist Party. Indeed, Sartre knows since he recognizes that workers join the Communist Party and judge it in terms of an overall appraisal of the nature of Communist parties and the USSR. We explained this to the Trotskyists as early as 1947. In the USSR, if the USSR actually is a worker state and the CPs are proletarian parties, criticisms aimed at their policy become secondary and even gratuitous. And faced with such pseudo-differences, when it comes to a third world war and the atomic extermination of humankind, the worker will militate in the CP rather than waste his time with Sartre and his independent left. An independent organization will be able to take shape, therefore, only on the condition that it can show that the differences separating it from Stalinism are fundamental ones, i.e., they are concerned with the very nature of Stalinism. Both in the USSR and elsewhere. It will be able to gain a foothold within the proletariat only through a permanent and irreconcilable struggle against the ideology and policy of Stalinism, and of the bourgeoisie, it must be added. Will it be able to be, quote, in liaison with the CP, end quote, under such conditions? It is ridiculous even to pose the question. We need not recall that an orientation fundamentally opposed to Stalinism is a necessary but not in the least sufficient condition for the reconstruction of the revolutionary movement. A significant portion of the working class certainly must also achieve on its own a sufficient degree of political awareness to enable it to recognize in this ideology the explicit and consistent formulation of its own experience. The workers, quote, coming unstuck, end quote, from Stalinism, and their refusal to participate in actions clearly or vaguely perceived as being foreign to their interests as proletarians, constitute a necessary moment in this experience. It is going on right now before our eyes, and whether or not we want it to be the case, long periods of passivity and inaction are inseparable from this experience. It is inevitable that this experience will end up moving in a positive direction. Is it inevitable that this experience will end up moving in a positive direction, going beyond the present situation and toward revolution? Certainly not. The inevitable has no place in history. But the role of the revolutionary is not to remain hypnotized by the ambiguity of every given historical situation. It is rather to bring out the positive signification lying potentially within each such situation, and to struggle to bring it about. And in a period like the one we are now going through, this struggle begins with the reformulation of revolutionary ideology, and with its propagation among the most advanced workers. All this obviously will take a long time, and is not easy. We must have patience, much patience and stubborn persistence. And there always have been, and there always are, a few who have dug within themselves and forged this terrible patience. They are the people who began in time, working in the existing organizations, had their doubts, tried to interpret events step by step, experienced open conflict, and have had to retrench once again. Those people have paid for their knowledge of the infinite task about which Sartre speaks so cheerfully. They know about it well enough to know that most of the time one works for a far-off future that at present is still embedded deep in the gangue, Gangue, of the possible, and that the moments where one can finally do what one has been living a lifetime to do are rare and in no way guaranteed in advance. But Sartre is deaf in this ear. He cannot be patient. He has no time to lose. He has just arrived. He has to redeem himself. He needs some, quote, action, end quote, right away. and it doesn't matter what kind of action, just some effective action, any action in a grand style. He looks Lefort up and down with contempt, since the latter is happy keeping company, quote, with other intellectuals and a few highly cultivated workers, end quote. Sartre himself has to be able to harangue the crowd, to fill the Vel d'Hiv, VEL apostrophe D apostrophe HIV apostrophe. And to do this, he obviously must be in, quote, liaison, quote, in liaison with the CP, end quote. Otherwise, who will fill the Vel d'Hiv? In any case, not the independent left. This allows us to predict that unless some day or other he just drops it all, he will forget about his independent left, and his differences will fall into line with the CP. The contradiction between defending the Communist Party's entire line in some mysterious, quote, differences, end quote, or the chaste desire for an independent left, is not the only one found in Sartre's articles. It has found company in the meantime when he tried to reply to Claude Lefort. In the April issue of Le Temps Moderne, Lefort had shown that Sartre had succeeded in providing a defense and justification for Stalinism only by constantly distorting Marxism and by relegating it to the level of a rationalistic empiricism. Sartre's reply, 2 times longer than Lefort's criticism, is teeming with ineptitudes, nonsense, personally rude remarks, and lexical errors. And above all, it appears to be an explosion of hysteria, for in following his, quote, proofs, end quote, we begin to notice that Sartre, seized with a curious form of syllogistic ataxia, sometimes proves too much and sometimes not enough. This impression is only reinforced when we encounter the mass of contradictions contained therein. For example, quote, if one wanted to expose the shameful finalism which is hidden under all dialectics, end quote, Marx has allowed us to rediscover true dialectical time, end quote. Does every form of dialectic conceal a shameful finalism, or does the Marxist dialectic avoid doing so? After having spent about a dozen pages speaking ironically about the proletariat's, quote, cumulative experience, end quote, disputing whether the conditions for such an experience are given in reality, and claiming that it does not lead to the unity of the proletariat, Sartre adds coldly, quote, by the way, it's not that I'm against your cumulative experiences. Indeed, I think that the proletariat profits from everything, end quote. We could easily expand this list of contradictions, but it would be shallow merely to state them. For in each there are 2 terms of unequal weight. This can be seen first of all just statistically. With an ardor that would make you shudder, Sartre regularly devotes 5, 10, or 20 pages to demonstrating that without the party the class would be nothing, that exploitation brutalizes, crushes, and transforms the workers into things, that they are passion and the party pure action. Then an offhand phrase here or there tells us that the proletariat has a revolutionary nature, that it profits from everything, that it makes itself through its own daily action, that it is kept in motion through the consequence of its acts. Thus he himself shows how he believes seriously in only half of what he is saying and how the rest is just hot air. And yet, for once we have to take him seriously, since not only does the allocation of his pages have a meaning independent of him, but these theses by which he defends the bureaucracy have above all an objective significance and value. They have an objective significance because they overlap with a powerful social and historical current, and because they have a corresponding agent present everywhere in reality. But where then will Sartre today find that other half, the autonomous action of the proletariat? And they have an objective value because he gives expression to this justification for the bureaucracy that the bureaucracy gives itself but does not itself care to express. In founding the need for the party on the fact that the workers are brutalized, the bureaucracy must feel that with friends like this, idiotic fellow traveler who needs anti-communist enemies, but he rises thereby to a position of high historical importance that he would never possess in his own right. Let us therefore take him for what he really is, a clumsy but enthusiastic apologist who is self-taught but studious, contrite but aggressive, whose words are stilted but whose tongue is nimble. In short, the prototype of the modern intellectual in the process of constructing, with the materials of reason, the bridge of opportunity across the flood of history. The modern intellectual, that's in capital letters, capital M and capital I. The modern intellectual's great familiarity with theory inculcates in him a realistic and salutary contempt for systematic constructions. Plato or Spinoza, Fichte or Marx tried to harmonize their philosophy with their political ideas. They were pedants, discursive upstarts. The modern intellectual has this in common with the practical aristocrat of old and the corner shopkeeper. He keeps theory in its place. Theory is good for musty old books, but in real life it does not serve much purpose. With this, Sartre will tell us what the proletariat and its party are, and how we can rescue, quote, the working class, the entire French community, and peace, end quote, without, quote, fashioning or refashioning a theory of the proletariat, end quote. Such a theory, he says, appears to him to be, quote, useless, dangerous, and even presumptuous, end quote. What is useless, dangerous, and especially presumptuous, obviously, is to babble along mindlessly for 200 pages about the proletariat, the party, their relation, and so on, without having any general idea about them. Here we have the attitude of a political quack. Sartre, however, is innocent of this crime that overcomes him, and he rather should be accused of not knowing what he is doing. It obviously would have been impossible for Sartre to write everything he has written without having a theory or many of them. In fact, Sartre not only is well stocked in proletarian theory, he has some left over to spare. He is dripping with it from head to foot. Like every theory that is not recognized as such, it is a confused and contradictory pile of prejudices, hearsay, and ill-digested ideas. Wanting to do theory does not suffice for it to be done well, but not wanting to do theory leads necessarily to doing theory badly. Sartre had furnished his own proof of this a few lines earlier when he put forward the following proposition. In my opinion, the class unceasingly makes itself, does itself, and remakes itself, which in no way means that it returns to its point of departure, end quote. Even the least discerning reader will have recognized here a general theoretical proposition, so general in fact that it goes beyond the grounds of the working class and can be applied profitably to the four elements, to various French governments, to colonial expeditions, and to raccoons. Everything makes itself, undoes itself, and remakes itself unceasingly, and it rarely returns to its point of departure. May the reader, however, be patient. We still are only on the third page of Sartre's reply. What the hell? In the remaining 56 pages, we might just find nestled away in some small corner the specific difference between the working class and becoming in general. Let us look and see instead. In his critique, Lefort pointed out to Sartre that for Marxism there are objective factors, socio-historical factors of course, that tend to make the proletariat a revolutionary class. And Lefort pointed out the most important ones: the concentration of the proletariat, the need to cooperate that capitalist production forces upon the proletariat, the continuous upheaval brought about by the introduction of new techniques, which can occur only because the proletariat adapts these techniques and makes them work in practice. After having said that he has never, quote, denied the objective foundations of this class, end quote, Sartre devotes several pages of his reply proving that there is nothing to these foundations, that such factors have no significance, unless, of course, they have the opposite effect, namely to, quote, crush, end quote, the proletariat. Hence he goes on to prove too much, even with respect to his goal, which is the, quote, justification, end quote, of the bureaucracy. As a consequence, he now no longer needs the proletariat, but merely the exploited in general. First of all, let us look at the process of concentration. Quote, concentration only acts through the milieu and existing forms, end quote. Sartre says rather sententiously, quote, concentration only acts through milieu and existing forms, end quote. Sartre says rather sententiously. But who said that the process of concentration acted outside of milieu and structures? Marxism has nothing to do with the concentration of asparagus, or with the concentration of people in general. It is interested in the concentration of a precise category of individuals, industrial producers, within a determinate process, the development of large-scale industry. In given places, towns and modern factories, inside a given system and during a given historical period, the capitalist system and its period of history. Does Sartre seriously believe that Tamerlane's gathering of 100,000 horsemen in the middle of the steps has the same effect and significance for a Marxist at Ford's gathering of 100,000 workers in the Rouge factories in Detroit? It is simply stupid to contrast the proletariat of the United States, which has not been made revolutionary by the process of concentration, to the less concentrated but more politicized French proletariat, in order to prove, well, to prove what? That the process of concentration is not the sole important factor? But who said the process of concentration was the sole important factor? I misread that. Who said the process of concentration was the only important factor? That concentration does not matter at all? This Sartre does not say. Then what? Indeed, what allows Sartre to see in the history of the American proletariat only, quote, the CIO's pitiful compromises, end quote, and a, quote, growing indifference, end quote. What, if not his parochial horizons as a parishioner of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and his deep conviction that what happens in France is the universal norm? It is well known that, quote, insurrectionary passion, end quote, is one of those fancy Parisian commodities. This certainly is what prevents Sartre from seeing the, quote, growing indifference, end quote, of the French proletariat between 1921 and 1930, or between 1947 and X, and the, quote, pitiful compromises, end quote, by which its two parties, quote, knew to stop the strikes, end quote, in June 1936, or to chain them to the production lines between 1944 and 1947. In the history of the American proletariat, there are nothing but, quote, pitiful compromises, end quote, and a, quote, growing indifference, end quote. If in the history of the American proletariat there are nothing but, quote, pitiful compromises, end quote, and a, quote, growing indifference, end quote, what explains the strength of unions there, or the working class's standard of living, which is 3 times higher than in France? The benevolence of the big trusts, perhaps? Their, quote, socially concerned outlook, end quote, as Parisian journalists say after a 2-week transatlantic tour? And why, in the face of this growing indifference and of these unions, and why, in the face of this growing indifference and of these unions, who ask only to make pitiful compromises, do the trusts end up granting increases instead of forcing lower wages? Undoubtedly, they have not been informed about the CIO and the American proletariat. that will teach them that they should subscribe to le temps moderne. Let's see how that's actually pronounced. One second. God damn it. Sorry. I know this is annoying, but I would like to know how to pronounce this.
Les temps modernes. Les temps modernes. Les temps modernes.
Les temps modernes.
Les temps modernes.
Okay. Les temps modernes. Instead of handsomely supporting, that will teach them that they should subscribe to les temps modernes, instead of handsomely supporting some impostors who claim to be, quote, labor relations, end quote, experts, but who know less about such matters than Sartre. But that is not the main point. For by means of this apparently innocent tautology, that quote, quantity couldn't produce social effects except within the framework of an already structured society and as a function of existing structures, end quote. A much more significant truth is disguised, namely that structures are modified under the pressure of quantities. Structures do not exist eternally, and when they are overturned, quantitative changes play a fundamental role. Is the process of capital concentration anything other than a continual modification of the absolute and relative size of business enterprises? But while this process of concentration develops, it gradually or abruptly changes a whole series of specific economic and social structures. Marx first analyzed the transition from simple cooperation to manufacturing, and then to large-scale industry, and its effects on the working class, at too great a length for us to have to go over it again here. Second, let us look at the process of cooperation in the performance of work by attributing to Lefort the idea that capitalism idyllically develops a proletariat in pure positivity. We do not know where Sartre got this. Sartre gives himself the ridiculous task of wanting to prove that, quote, cooperation is not lived by the worker as the lucky sign of solidarity, end quote, and that instead he, quote, expresses dependency, end quote. Sartre does not even seem to suspect that this is what Lefort has been trying to get him to understand, and that this is what has become, and that this is what has been said since Marx. That the process of capitalist production, quote, unites, educates, and disciplines, end quote, the workers in the feeling of their mutual dependence and inculcates in them, whether they like it or not, both the idea that this dependence is inevitable, and a rejection of the alienated form this dependence takes in the factory and in capitalist society. Finally, let us look at the continuous upheaval brought about by the introduction of new techniques. Here Sartre is, quote, frankly, end quote, indignant. What infamy indeed! The factory that maims the worker, the compartmentalized work that ruins the lovely, quote, professional culture, end quote, of yesteryear, along with the artisan's, quote, intuitive understanding of the material, end quote. To see anything in this other than destruction and abasement, one must, quote, lack imagination, end quote, as well as heart. Sartre lacks neither of these, and with his heart driving his imagination on, he describes at length the workers', quote, brutalization, end quote, their, quote, psychoses, end quote, this vegetative life in which, quote, they go home, eat dinner, yawn, and go to sleep, end quote. Here too we are astonished. For Lefort has seen this life from the workers themselves. He has seen more of this life than Sartre will see during his whole lifetime, and from closer range. Sartre has his marks at home, with the pages cut and annotated. Has he then understood nothing of what he has seen, of what he has read, or rather is what Sartre is expounding a new discovery, that he modestly has buried between citations of Marx and references to biologists and, quote, psychotechnicians, end quote. Of course not. None of this is new. Everyone has known it for a long time, but what is relatively new is the will to see only this in the relationship between the proletariat and technical developments. Oh, quite relatively new indeed, for Sartre has a few precursors. One fine day, 10 years ago, Burnham announced his great discovery. Marx was mistaken. The proletariat was becoming less and less capable of managing society. Professional skills were being lost under modern capitalism, etc. Marx had conferred upon the proletariat the role of capitalism's successor, but this proletariat now has found itself incapable of fulfilling this role. Whence comes the positive historical mission of the, quote, managers, end quote, i.e. bureaucrats. Neither the premises nor the conclusions differ in Sartre's formulation except that he prefers a particular bureaucracy, that of the Stalinist Party. We'll come back later on this aspect of the question as well as to the influence of technical upheavals. But let us linger for an instant on the pedantic way in which Sartre upbraids Lefort. Quote, perhaps you are dreaming of the, quote, cultural, end quote, influence of compartmentalized work. In that case, I regret to inform you that Anglo-Saxon and German, exclamation point, investigations will destroy your pretty dream. The cultural influence of compartmentalized work is entirely negative. It has liquidated professional culture, etc., end quote. This simple statement proves that Sartre neither knows nor is capable of imagining what he is talking about. Only a fool could think that the compartmentalized work might as such have a positive cultural influence, and Anglo-Saxon and German investigations are extremely useful, except when one wants to prove that 2 + 2 = 4. Stupid remarks attributed to one's adversaries merely point to the stupid remarks one is capable of producing on one's own. Sartre does not suspect that, unlike him, not everyone is just starting to discover the working class, compartmentalized work, and so on. That there are people like Lefort who spend their lives reflecting on these questions, that perhaps they do not reflect upon them well, but that one cannot teach them anything by telling them that the parts are contained within the whole, that a dog has 4 paws, and that compartmentalized work has a negative influence upon professional culture. But does compartmentalized work have a, quote, entirely negative, end quote, influence on the working class? Let us leave that to the Wagner of Les Temps Modernes and open up Marx. After having depicted the workers during the period of small-scale artisanal production, Marx concludes, quote, medieval craftsmen therefore had an interest in their special work and in proficiency in it, which was capable of rising to a limited artistic sense. For this very reason, however, every medieval craftsman was completely absorbed in his work, to which he had a complacent servile relationship, and in which he was involved to a far greater extent than the modern worker, whose work is a matter of indifference to him, end quote. Marx. Right away we begin to breathe in different air. We feel ourselves elevated to higher levels of historical reflection. For Marx, artisanal activity and the professional culture that goes along with it allows a realization of the individual personality. The artisan is interested in his particular work, a realization that attains a historical value, quote, a limited historical sense, end quote. But the negative predominates. Absorption in this particular job, a limited horizon, a kind of subordination that is not an imposed subordination, but a much more serious kind of subordination, since it is accepted, internalized, and valued by the individual. The professional worker wants to be a good professional. He is proud of it. From the point of view of subsequent historical developments, however, this is a foolish pride. The goal humanity ought to assign itself certainly is not to produce perfect tailors, carriage makers, or weavers. Capitalism transcends this situation. By undermining the objective bases for this charming professional culture, capitalism undoubtedly destroys personal realization within a particular job. But capitalism does more than that. Capitalism suppresses its very meaning and demonstrates in practice to this foolish person what it is to put his pride and the meaning of his life in an activity machines can accomplish better and more quickly than he, and by showing the accidental character of a person's connection with any particular kind of productive labor. It demonstrates better than any philosophy could that material production has no meaning by itself except as a means, and that, quote, the realm of freedom can blossom forth only with this realm of necessity as its basis, and with the shortening of the working day as its basic prerequisite, end quote. The worker rebels against being treated as an accident, and every day in modern production he learns that he can only be treated as an accident. He can get out of this situation only by becoming totally brutalized or by seizing hold of production and reducing production to its true significance as a type of activity that is subordinate to man. At the same time, the interchangeability of tasks shows him, in practical terms, that all particular modes of production can be dominated by the modern individual, whereas the modes of production, now predominate. What does Sartre understand of all that? Nothing, we must think. Lefort has spoken of the interchangeability of tasks. Sartre responds to him that the interchangeability of individuals is the main cause of unemployment. Even if he were a, quote, remarkably intelligent, end quote, gentleman, he would need to know something of the things he is talking about. The interchangeability of tasks is a typical phenomenon of modern industry that makes a semi-skilled machinist capable of working on practically any mass production machine after a training session that varies from a few minutes to a few days. The technical objective basis for this comes from the fact that the immense majority of modern machines are derivations or specialized versions of 2 or 3 general-purpose types of machinery. This is universality turned into an object, a historical object, and we are trying to get Sartre to understand that it entails a corollary for the subject who has invented these tools and who adapts them and utilizes them. But, quote, remarkably intelligent, end quote, he decidedly is not. For if he were, even in his ignorance of these matters, he would not confuse the interchangeability of individuals and the interchangeability of tasks. Were each of them always to be called by the other's name, he still would not have to confuse 2 different aspects, from which there arise different significations. But one does not have to mix up their names. The interchangeability of individuals exists independently of the interchangeability of tasks. Tailors, shoemakers, and school teachers are interchangeable within their respective corporations. Interchangeability of individuals, but not with each other. The interchangeability of tasks. And it is dishonest to throw into the bargain the insinuation that Lefort sees already realized in the compartmentalized worker, quote, the complete development of the universal concrete individual, end quote. At the very point where the latter says that automation, quote, makes the worker aware of a universality that the abolition of exploitation alone could allow him to achieve, end quote. Sartre, therefore, is trying to prove in a few pages that the proletariat's objective situation cannot have any signification. And what do we, who also are successors to Marx, want to prove? that the proletariat placed in this situation tends to have a common experience of this situation, and that this experience is one of the moments in its constitution as a class. Now Sartre, who is just as comfortable on the terrain of philosophy as he is in the field of economics, spurns this idea. One cannot prove, quote, the unity of the proletariat by the unity of the proletariat's experience, end quote. For, quote, the unity of its experience, when it develops progressively, presupposes the unity of the proletariat, end quote. This is a meaningless sentence, for what matters here is not a theory of knowledge, nor the ego as the principle of the synthetic unity of apperception. Trying to think. Sorry, I took a class in undergraduate about Kant's critique of pure reason. I'm trying to remember the synthetic unity of apperception, but I think it's something to the effect of the necessity of a coherent, unified, singular ego being necessary for the perception of the multitude of empirical sensation that we categorize via the 12 categories of what? I forget what fucking called. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is whether the workers qua workers tend to share a common experience, and whether in this experience that unfolds through time there is a meaningful succession. In other words, whether tomorrow merely is juxtaposed to yesterday or goes beyond it. What matters, in a word, is whether we can speak of a history of the proletariat. Do we need to presuppose the ontological or transcendental unity of a group in order to speak of the unity of its experience? What is the experiential unity of a score of youngsters who all went to the same school and played in the same vacant lots throughout their childhood? An incomplete experience, of course. What else but the identity of the school, of the teachers, and of the neighborhood of their age? The unity of experience, to the extent and within the limits it exists, is posited by the identity or the similarity of objective conditions in which the group finds itself placed. To say that each individual belonging to the group will perceive these conditions and express them in an experience according to the structures that are his own is true enough on the scale of an atomistic microsociology, but it becomes a source of sophisms when we consider the masses on the scale of history. If the, quote, group, end quote, in consideration is reduced to two individuals witnessing the same brief event, it is doubtful that they even have had the same, quote, same perception, end quote, of the event, which they express in like fashion in the language of describing physical facts. Each will have perceived numerous and important elements differently, and in any case the signification each will attribute to the fact will be different. But if the groups in question include millions of individuals who, over generations from birth to death, and in every essential respect face identical or similar conditions, it is a safe bet that the unity of its experience will go quite far. Common traits will emerge, gradually or by fits and starts. Each individual will tend to recognize in the other the bearer of an essentially similar experience. The unity of the experience of the, quote, proletariat, end quote, is first of all the experiential unity of millions of individuals whom capitalism places in identical conditions, and hence it presupposes at the start only the unity of the capitalist system. Of course, it also presupposes that the exploited are possible subjects of experience in general, in other words, people. Undoubtedly, this is only the beginning of the story, and it takes many long years, if not centuries, for this experience shared by individuals to be recognized in a reciprocal manner, raised to the level of certitude concerning their ultimate and inexorable inclusion in a general unity, bracket ensemble, end bracket, transcending the particular individuals, and transformed from passive solidarity into collective action. We'll come back to this in an instant. All the same, the pseudo-dialectical circularity posited by Sartre is just a bad play on words. Capitalism creates workers and imposes on them a common experience. It imposes on them even the idea of belonging to a class. Sartre keeps on repeating that he is not a worker, but has he never been paid a wage or salary? When an employer or an administrator says, quote, I am lowering or increasing pay by so much, I am increasing or reducing working hours by so much, end quote, what else is he doing but grabbing this mass of individuals by the scruff of the neck and yelling in their ears, quote, to me you're not a Smith, a Jones, or a Sartre. You are an accidental example of the category of wage earner. And if that doesn't meet with your satisfaction, here's the door, end quote. And if the wage earner finds this situation as it is presented to him intolerable, will he have to have a party membership card in his pocket or the complete works of Maurice Thorez? Maurice Thorez is, I think he was the leader of the French Communist Party at this point in history, in the 1950s. Will he have to have a party membership card in his pocket or the complete works of Maurice Thorez at home in order to come to the realization that those on his left side or those on his right side ought to find this situation equally intolerable, to discuss it with them and to come up with the idea of responding to it together? In all this, does one merely experience, quote, dependence, end quote? Or is there not a common experience of dependence, and is not a common response the only possible response? At first, the proletariat in itself is matter to be exploited by capital. This in itself is already transcended, and as such, as soon as exploitation is experienced, as soon as one is not limited to being exploited, but knows oneself to be exploited, and under the conditions of capitalism, one is aware of being exploited immediately as a participant in a specific social category. This experience is already a rudimentary for itself, a for itself that is fully acknowledged as soon as the experience no longer is passively accepted, but becomes, through common action against the shared situation, an active practice, a strike, a revolt, or revolution. And henceforth the proletariat will be just that, the permanent possibility proletarians themselves possess of positing in practice their for itself qua class. That under the conditions of capitalism, this leads them to strive for power, and to set as their goal the attainment of communism is another story. We will come back to that. But from this moment on, the truth is not that the unity of the proletariat is the process of making itself build up the unity of its experience, but rather that the history of the proletariat is the history of the efforts of these people to posit their for itself and to seize power for themselves. But that's no good, says Sartre. Quote, the proletariat is crushed by a perpetual present, end quote. This is mere literary phrasing. It might be true, strictly speaking, of animals, but certainly not of proletarians. If it were true, it would have put an end to history. History with capital H, by now. A support for this, it says, an end to history, lowercase h, and then in parentheses it says history with a capital H, by now. As support for this absurd statement, Sartre cites Marx, who says, quote, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier epochs. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify, end quote. But Marx concluded this very same passage with a sentence Sartre glides over in silence, quote, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind, end quote. Sartre's quotation thus becomes a falsification of Marx. For Marx, the, quote, constant revolutionizing, end quote, the capitalist mode of production introduces into social relations is of course what compels man to rid himself of the solid, the fixed, the traditional, and the holy, and to face, quote, with sober senses, end quote, the conditions of his life and his relation with others. It is what forces him to see in what is simply there something that is necessarily dedicated to destruction. It is what destroys domination exercised through what is merely inherited and thus accidental. This constant upheaval, Marx means to say, puts man through a double apprenticeship. It demolishes the mystifications that cover the reality of social relations, but also, and more profoundly still, it demonstrates the relativity of these relations and of everything given, even in reality itself. It forces man to see that reality is the hitherto blind product of man's actions, and therefore that it can be transformed by him. And because the working class is placed at the core of this process of perpetual destruction, of permanent revolution in the reality dominating all other forms of reality, the reality of production, it tends to be a revolutionary class and a universal class. Thus, Marx was saying that the working class experiences this perpetual upheaval, hence it is obliged to understand and transcend the relativity of the present. Sartre has him say that the working class experiences this perpetual upheaval, therefore it is dumbfounded by it. Sartre does something worse than falsify Marx. He attributes to Marx Sartre's own superficiality. Sartre continues, quote, "How can you imagine that the new crop of workers who arose around 1910 are going to take up again the aristocratic traditions of revolutionary syndicalism and of tradesmen? Change, yes. Historical and cumulative change, surely not." End quote. We know what history means for Sartre. What grows slowly and surely, like a beard. The historical, therefore, would be sedimented, the gradual, the incremental. Till now we thought that, rather than beards in public record archives, history was made up of wars, revolutions, and atomic bombs. But the word is unimportant, it being one of 59 unfortunate expressions found in this article. Indeed, there is historical change in the true sense in the proletariat, i.e. upheaval, the entrance of new strata en masse into industry, the revival of struggle after long periods of inaction. And then what? There is or is not a history of humanity. But catastrophes, wars, invasions, and revolutions do not prove the non-existence of such a history. Those who have tried to show that there is no history in general have not, in order to prove it, had recourse to these sorts of events. Rather, they have analyzed whether the various extant historical cultures might have drawn from each era different significations lacking any genuine and organic mutual connections. This enterprise obviously contradicts itself. Sartre might have tried to show, without contradicting himself, however, that the meanings that can be extracted from each phase of the proletariat's existence are not coherent and do not mutually imply one another. To do that, he would have had to analyze at least two stages in the history of the labor movement, and to show that these stages are in no way interconnected, or worse, that neither has any signification at all, that they are only chaos and incoherence. Instead of doing that, he makes upheaval into another absolute and caricatures Marx as Cratylus caricatured Heraclitus. You will not enter even once into the same river. For, quote, constant revolutionizing, end quote, is the upheaval brought about in the modes of production, in social relations, in organization, and in ideas, but certainly not a continuous evacuation from the factories. It never meant that at regular intervals the factories are scoured clean of their current personnel, and that some individuals fallen from the sky park themselves in front of the machinery. As we explained to the young child, to salt one's meat does not mean to empty the whole salt shaker onto one's plate. Even at the times when capitalism creates an influx of new masses of people into the factories, for example in the United States between 1940 and 1945, The majority is still made up of the guys who were there before. They continue working mixed in among the new workers. Then, of course, there are parties. Certainly not the absolute party, the idea of the party, the one party, spherical and equal to itself all around, with which Sartre conducts his business, but contingent and mortal parties, made up of perishable individuals who come from the class and return to the class. In and through these parties, militants are trained and educated. Not only do they live in the midst of action, they tend to reflect systematically upon the struggles they experience. Later on, they pass into other organizations, bringing with them this experience and their reflections. Already, however, we see that we have to make some generalizations. It no longer is a matter of parties as such. It is a matter of militants and more generally of the class's vanguard, about which Sartre evidently I tried to read a text message and talk at the same time. It no longer is a matter of parties as such. It is a matter of militants and more generally of the class's vanguard. It no longer is a matter of parties as such, it is a matter of militants and more generally of the class's vanguard, about which Sartre evidently does not have a word to say, i.e. of workers who more often than others tend to participate in economic or political struggles or to initiate them, to reflect on these struggles and to think always within the context of future struggles. The working class has no memory other than that of the individuals who make it up, for it is neither a single individual nor a group with memory-saving institutions. The answer to the problem of the historical unity of proletarian action is to be found elsewhere. To the extent that something like a class, quote, memory, end quote, exists, however, it can be located in this vanguard. Quote, all observers noted that the young workers had almost no understanding of the strikes of 1936, end quote, Sartre says. These omniscient observers, aren't they insightful? It is true that before putting themselves out, they could have thought about the fact that young workers today were 3 years old in 1936, and that since then they have had more pressing matters to attend to than to read about June 1936 in one of the few books that exist on the subject. But what would happen if a strike broke out today? During the last strike at Renan, the unions, as usual, acted like strike breakers, of course with various nuances, and the workers were profoundly disgusted by them. And as the days passed by, to the extent that the continuation of the strike in the 4-horsepower car department raised the issue of what to do faced with the attitude of the workers as a whole, only one thing was discussed throughout the entire factory: June 1936. You do not have to be a wizard to understand that if in a department of 200 or 300 workers there is some old guy who took part in such an event, he always will get a hearing from the others, conditions permitting. A worker's work life extends over 40 or 50 years, from the Commune till the First World War, from 1910 until today. In each factory, in each workshop, one can find a few workers who took part in the great struggles of the past. Here is the class's leavening. Here's the class's leavening. Those people who vividly serve as the connection between the past and the present for their comrades. That they sometimes are 5% and sometimes 50% makes no difference. 1 in 1,000 will suffice on a day when there is something to be done. But this has no existence for Sartre. Where would you want him to meet up with this vanguard? What exists for him is the following dichotomy: the working class an abstract and even imaginary entity, which is nowhere to be seen, then the party, Stalinist of course, which is to be seen all the time, in its newspapers, among its militants, at meetings, and on posters and voting ballots. If you want to meet the party, you know where to go, but no one can show you which bus to take to find the, quote, working class, end quote. It is a, quote, cloud of dust, end quote. And yet this cloud of dust clusters together sometimes at the Vel d'Hiv, V-E-L apostrophe D apostrophe H-I-V apostrophe, or from Place de la Nation to the Bastille on May Day. There are the workers, a good number of them at least, and they are doing something together. If one looks more closely, however, one sees that they did not go there all alone. Someone has called them together, gathered them together, marshaled them, given them placards, started chants. Who, good Lord? It's the party. Hence we have found the long-sought-after, quote, unity, end quote. And why stop in the middle of this road when things are going so well? Why limit oneself just to May Day? We still settle for no less than history and its magnificent vistas. What guarantees, quote, the unity of experience, end quote, and continuity through the vicissitudes of life? The party. All this, which seems to Sartre at the same time both obvious and profound, cannot hold up against even the most superficial scrutiny. The party, insofar as when it exists, is an expression of the proletariat's continuity, not its presupposition. The proletariat's continuity's presupposition. First of all, the adventures described as happening to the proletariat happen to the party tenfold. To be unaware of this fact, one needs to have Sartre's limited field of vision and to be as exclusively preoccupied as he is with the problems raised by his integration into Stalinism hic et nunc, or hic et nunc, in France and in 1953. The party, or rather parties, for the party is an objective and not a reality. These parties create themselves, destroy themselves, are exterminated by the police and abandoned by the class. They reappear, undergo scissions, exist in multiple copies, accuse each other of treason, change the program, turn it into a scrap of paper, revive it, have new generations of followers enter into them en masse. In a word, to take up Sartre's profound expression, they make themselves, undo themselves, and remake themselves non-stop. They are subjected to the same process of constant upheaval as the class itself, but much more intensely so because they are much more structured and clearly defined, much more, quote, solid and fixed, end quote, and therefore much more shaken and swept up by events. The continuity that these kinds of parties can guarantee to the working class is a continuity of 10 or 20 years, and each generation already has this kind of continuity for itself. The idea of the party as the guarantor of continuity, as the principle of unity in time and in space, could be debated if the party actually existed as a unity, but it does not. Of course, however, Sartre perhaps will say that this unity is not given, that it is a task that must always be resumed. Very well then, here we have gotten out of Stalinist Catholicism, and who should resume it? Starting from what? By being oriented toward what? Could it be by chance the proletarian vanguard, starting from its own experience, orienting itself towards the goal itself, toward the goals it itself is trying to define? Then everything's settled, and Sartre would have done all that scribbling for nothing. For then he would have recognized that the party is only a moment in this long struggle, in the course of which the proletariat tends both to define a historical role for itself and to realize it, and that this struggle and not the party is the principle of the proletariat's unity and of its history. Were the party's unity actually to exist, however, that still would not prove at all what Sartre is trying to prove. As a matter of fact, he has transcended philosophy so completely that he keeps switching from being to ought to be, from fact to value, and from explanation to justification. He repeats endlessly, since the Communist Party of France is here, That proves that it ought to be here. Likewise, he is hell-bent on proving against this poor Trotskyist, Mr. Germain, bracket, Ernest Mandel, end quote, end bracket, that if the USSR and Stalinist policy are as they are so necessarily, which is a tautology. Hence, they represent a revolutionary state and a revolutionary policy, which is silly. All right, there's a bunch of names here, so here I'll list them off. Germain, Malenkov, Sartre, Bourdet, Guy Mollet, Mendes, France, Vidal, Pinet, Laniel, and de Gaulle are all necessarily what they are. We know it a priori, and we more or less can prove it a posteriori. So what? Or is Malenkov privileged because he is in power? And what about Laniel then? Because he says that his power is based on the working class. And what about Tito then? Because Sartre, having reflected on the situation and having looked into his power base, has concluded that Malenkov speaks the truth and Tito lies? Is the contrary, then, a priori unthinkable? And to come up with that conclusion, where does he get the criteria? Not in the party itself, of course. Could the party be reason, capital R, itself, which includes within itself its own criteria? In the history and experience of proletarian struggles? But then, why can't a worker do what Sartre is doing? And why can't he arrive at the opposite conclusion? This mediation, that is the party, who gave it the right? Why should the party by definition be the true expression of proletarian continuity, and not its necessarily mystified expression, as some people maintain? Or simply one of its expressions, sometimes true, sometimes mystified? From where does it get its status as true mediation? To that question, Sartre does not hesitate to respond, from the very fact that the proletariat recognizes it as such. Come on! So now we can presuppose the unity of the proletariat and assume that the proletariat now possesses a criterion for truth? No. The party unifies the proletariat, which in turn recognizes in the party its true expression. But is the proletariat therefore no longer crushed by a perpetual present? No. The party, quote, makes it see, end quote, its past. But how can an amnesiac check the story he is being told about his own past? And which proletariat, which party, when, where? In the end, the problem becomes easy for Sartre. At least desire to play dollies with praxis has overtaken him. He has found before him a party that the workers, quote, recognize, end quote, more or less, but he tries to dodge this issue in order to simplify things for himself. Since he does not rack his brains with what goes on beyond the borders of the most beautiful realm on earth, and since he still has some time left here, whether he will become a complete Stalinist later on or go back to his more customary pursuits, he does not seem to have an inkling that there are moments when it is necessary to choose between two opposing parties. Workers and revolutionary militants know, however, that these are the crucial moments of action. What should have been done in 1914, for example? On the one hand, there was the party, the International, continuity itself, its functionaries, its honored leaders who had proved themselves, and the working class, which considered them its chiefs, or at least did not disavow them. On the other hand, there was a band of crackpots, or at least they were considered as such by the Sartres of the time, which accused the International of being a, quote, stinking corpse, end quote. and invited the workers to go in for some absurd and utopian ventures, like transforming the war into revolution. What should a German militant have done in 1918? A Russian militant in 1923? A Spanish militant in 1936? An East Berlin worker in 1953? Where was the unity, the mediation, the continuity during these moments that have decided decades of history? Where were the criteria? Sartre has the correct criterion in his hip pocket. Quote, "The true idea is an effective action," end quote. Sartre undoubtedly believes he is reaching the summits of Marxism with this affirmation, but in fact he is only expressing a vulgar pragmatism that is moreover the organic philosophy of the bureaucracy. For if Marx greatly deepened the meaning of the Copernican revolution that began with Kant, when he showed not only that all knowledge is knowledge for the subject, but also that this subject is a historical subject, hence essentially practical active, he in no way intended thereby to offer up a new transcendent criterion of truth, a new model, practice, to which what one thinks would be compared in order to see if one's thoughts were true. For practice does not include its own interpretation. Practice refers one toward further reflection. If reflection exists, quote, "in this world," end quote, only in connection with practice, practice has meaning only as practice is related to an idea. And this movement alone is historical truth. Truth is an infinite task. All this is still abstract, of course, for society is divided into classes, and hence each has a truth and a, quote, efficacy, end quote, of its own. The true idea is the effective one, you say. Did Hitler therefore share in the truth? Oh, he was not effective since he was overthrown. But what about beforehand? And what about Franco? And is not everything overthrown one day or another? You talk to me about fascists and the bourgeoisie. Fine. Let's talk about Scheidemann and Noske. Here we have working class ministers, Marxists, very effective ones. Through their praxis, they proved that the German Revolution was impossible in 1919. Hence, they were right. And what about Stalin when he assassinated Trotsky? His attempts failed several times, so he was not yet completely in the right. But the day Stalin achieved full revolutionary consciousness, he proved this worldliness of his thinking by effectively assassinating Trotsky, or perhaps the effectiveness of Trotsky's assassination plunged him into revolutionary truth, or rather the accomplishment of the one accomplished the other. Within the context, Sartre places it in. Within the context, Sartre places it, and in light of his, quote, proof, end quote, the idea that, quote, praxis decides, end quote, is only the expression of the most cynical opportunism. For if praxis decides something, it decides after the action has taken place, so much longer afterward that what has to be decided is of greater importance. Praxis will have, quote, decided, end quote, the truth of what we are saying to each other, only on the morrow of communism's complete and non-degradable instauration over the whole planet. But then this truth will be of little interest. From 1914 to 1917, praxis decided day after day that Lenin was wrong. Then everything came tumbling down. Lenin was in the right, since he made the revolution that he had predicted and called for. Was Lenin in the right beginning October 26, 1917? This is what people who join victorious revolutions the day after they happen think. You need to keep up with the times. It is praxis that decides. If someday a proletarian revolution seizes power in France, Sartre probably will sing its praises to the skies the day afterward. If the role of the poet, as Rilke said, is to say what is, let us add that the role of the intellectual is to glorify it. But did Lenin, through praxis, provide the definitive demonstration of the fact that he was right? The revolution degenerated later on, and the Mensheviks who were against the revolution before it occurred thought they had proved that he was wrong, since this degeneration supposedly showed that Russia was not, quote, ripe, end quote, for socialism. Will we ever find our bearings again amid all this, guided by, quote, the praxis that decides, end quote, and by, quote, effective action, end quote? And, quote, effective, end quote, in relation to what? Sartre dawdles around, showing that the PCF is effective, and forgets that judgments concerning effectiveness presuppose first of all an extrapolation through time, and then a definition of the objective in relation to which an action is or is not effective. There is someone to whom it would be as cruel to compare him as it would be to compare Beethoven to the composer of the, quote, Vienne pour Paul, end quote. But we must do it since he fills the public arena with his cacophonous noises. This someone who spent his life making revolutions, I mean Trotsky, wrote volume upon volume to demonstrate that Stalinist policy is not effective, that it leads to the ruin of the Soviet state and of the world proletariat, and that one day the Stalinist bureaucracy will collapse under the weight of its crimes and errors. Crimes and errors committed out of necessity, no doubt, but historically ineffective ones. Sartre himself has decided that the bureaucracy is ever effective, that it always will be there. Were he ever to read Trotsky, or were he to, quote, reread him, to, quote, reread, end quote, Trotsky, as he loves to say with much magnanimity, he would discover perhaps that he is making a miscalculation. But there is something more important. We believe that Trotsky was mistaken in thinking of the bureaucracy as ineffective, for he was judging it in relation to an objective, communism, that is not the bureaucracy's objective. Everything the bureaucracy does works towards suppressing the possibility of communist revolution. In doing this, however, the bureaucracy is effective. It is effective for itself and with regard to the objective it aims at, which is not communism but the consolidation and expansion of its power and its system of rule. And on the day of supreme effectiveness, when from the balcony of the Red Figaro, Sartre will be privileged to applaud Marshal Popov and Maurice Thorez marching down the Champs-Élysées. I don't know how to say that. Let me do this real quick.
Champs-Élysées. Champs-Élysées. Champs-Élysées.
Champs-Élysées. Champs-Élysées. I think that's what's being said. Thorez, and on the day, let me try to reread that whole sentence. And on the day of supreme effectiveness, when from the balcony of the Red Figaro, Sartre will be privileged to applaud Marshal Popov and Maurice Thorez marching down the Champs-Élysées. Praxis will have decided for him that Stalinism is true, and not just another way of exploiting the workers. Effectiveness is effectiveness in relation to a goal, and the goal of the workers is not that of the bureaucrat, just as the goal of the worker is not that of the bourgeois. But it's not the workers' allegiance to Stalinism in France and Italy that makes the latter into the revolutionary party on a world scale. There is also the power Stalinism has already achieved, first of all in Russia. Sartre is constantly explaining and justifying the concrete policy of various communist parties. We already have shown that, for him, the explanation and justification are the same thing. By referring to the revolutionary character of the USSR, the fundamental assumption of its system. Thus, for example, the American Communist Party's abandonment of the anti-racist struggle during the war was based upon the need, quote, not to provide Nazi propaganda with any arguments, end quote. While the war was on and Russia was in danger. Russia's safety is the supreme law, and that is the case because Russia is a workers' state. It may well be seen that if in reality Russia is not a workers' state, the policy of various communist parties becomes doubly reactionary, both in its means and in its ends. One is inclined to think that Sartre would have examined more closely his assumptions before going any further, especially since this assumption is being attacked more and more every day from all sides, since it has been attacked for years by Lefort even in his own review. Since it is still now being indirectly but clearly attacked by Péju's articles on the Slansky trial. The Slansky trial was the Slansky trial, I guess it's Slansky. I thought it was Schlansky, but you know, just thinking of Jordan Schlansky from the Conan O'Brien show. The Slansky trial was some type of anti-Semitic show trial that happened after World War II in the Soviet bloc. Anyway, are you kidding? To examine these assumptions is just, quote, pompous and simplistic, end quote, nitpicking, end quote. This is how Sartre rids himself of the, quote, Russian question, end quote, the touchstone for understanding the problems of the workers' movement for the past 30 years. You can state that the French workers play the cat's paw for the USSR, he says, only if you, quote, only if you can, quote, show that the Soviet leaders no longer believe in the Russian Revolution or that they think the experience has ended in failure. It goes without saying that even if this were true, which I strongly doubt, proving it would not be possible at this time, end quote. Sartre promises to return to this issue, quote, in the second installment, end quote, but he has not done so till now, unless we take into account his discussion with the Trotskyist, Mr. Germain. I think Mr. Germain's alias of Ernest Mandel, the Belgian Trotskyist. During this discussion, Sartre proved that the Russian leaders are revolutionary because they cannot do anything but what they are doing. First of all, a 12-year-old child could tell Sartre that what the Soviet leaders, quote, believe, end quote, or do not believe, has nothing to do with the matter. The exploitation of the Russian proletariat, which governs everything else, could not be instaurated just because Russian leaders no longer believed in the revolution, nor would it be abolished if Malenkov, struck by the hand of grace, began to believe in it again. Second, Sartre's argument about how it is impossible to, quote, prove, end quote, the contrary is an old, well-worn argument of crypto-Stalinists. If the crypto-Stalinist is told that the proletariat is exploited in the USSR, he does not lose his temper. He adopts the neutral, the most scientific voice possible and responds that there are no data to prove it. But then there no longer are any data to prove the contrary either, or to believe it. Unless you belong to that category of imbeciles defined by Lenin as those who believe others on their word, others being in this case the Stalinist bureaucracy armed with its propaganda. As his argument against the Trotskyists indicates, Sartre probably would respond to this that there was a socialist revolution in October 1917, and that the working class took power there, and that there has been no restoration of the bourgeoisie since then. But the question is not what happened in Russia in 1917, but what is happening there now in 1953. It is not a matter of knowing if the Russian working class seized power, but of whether it kept it. The assumption that it could lose it only, in italics, through a restoration of the classical bourgeoisie is untenable on the theoretical plane, and the quarrel over, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, signifies that in the absence of, quote, information, end quote, and proofs to the contrary, a Marxist would reject a priori the idea of working class power holding on in an isolated country for 35 years, since Stalin himself, quote, justified, end quote, the possibility of building socialism in Russia by appealing to the country's unique and exceptional characteristics. But Sartre pushes this cynical attitude further than the current crop of cryptos do. In his, quote, response to Lefort, end quote, he severely upbraids the latter. Do you have at your disposal, he asks him, the primary source documents needed to undertake a study of the, quote, working class, end quote, in the USSR? Quote, and if you do not have them, what can you say, that the worker is exploited in the USSR? From this standpoint, you have in mind especially the economic system. The discussion is open, but this is not what matters at this moment. That the working class, this time without quotation marks, is opposed to, parentheses, this time without quotation marks, author, and parentheses, is opposed to exploitation. Yes, that is our subject, but the sole proof you can furnish is that it is opposed to this exploitation because it cannot fail to be so without contradicting you, end quote. So the fact that the working class is exploited in the USSR relates especially to the economic system. This, quote, especially, end quote, is worth its weight in existential droolings. Might it not have been just the slightest relation to anything else? Within the context Sartre sets forth, we should think not. For Sartre, the fact that the economic system might be based upon the workers' exploitation has nothing to do with the rest of the issue. Exploitation does not determine society. It sheds no light on its class character. In Germany, the workers are blonde. At Toulon, they love to drink pastis, a licorice-flavored liquor. In Russia, they are exploited. Well, what about it? Go call up an anthropologist, a public health officer, an economist, says Sartre. It's not my business. And this after having for dozens of pages expounded the idea, which has become commonplace since Marx, that exploitation determines social reality from one end to the other, and in the very first place, the immediate being of the proletariat. Our subject, Sartre says shamelessly, is not whether the working class is exploited in Russia, but whether it is opposed to exploitation. As the paternalistic bourgeois proclaims, my workers are happy with their lot and know what's good for them better than troublemakers of your kind. Here again we discover how easily an individual's logical workings come unhinged when his real situation is out of kilter. For Sartre himself has explained in his previous article that the basic objectives of a system of exploitation is to destroy in the exploited person his opposition to exploitation, and indeed the idea that the Russian working class would not be opposed to being exploited, having assumed this exploitation to be established, not only would prove the contrary to what Sartre wants to prove, but in reality already has been used in order to prove its contrary. It has been used by those who maintain that Russian bureaucratic capitalism is barbarism, since it has destroyed in Russian proletarians even the possibility of opposing their exploitation, thereby transforming them into a class of modern industrial slaves. And what kind of opposition are we talking about here? Open question. in broad daylight, open opposition in broad daylight by means of strikes meeting street demonstrations. All that is practically impossible under a totalitarian regime, and its absence proves nothing. Did the absence of such demonstrations under Hitler and Mussolini prove that the German or Italian proletariat gave its blessing to its exploiters? Isn't it funny how the torturer of a gagged victim responds to you, "Well, you see, he's not protesting, he's really having a great time"? Might it not be a muffled, silent, everyday, and multiform kind of opposition that the workers carry on against exploitation in every country and under all kinds of circumstances when they refuse as much as possible to collaborate with their exploiters and to participate in the production process? If this opposition did not exist in Russia, why are there, quote, economic crimes, end quote, Stakhanovism, piecework wages, and poor workmanship in production, all of which constantly fills page after page in the Russian press? Would all that express the workers' allegiance to the system of rule that exploits them? Economic and social analysis does not have the same level of exactitude found in astronomy, but starting from the simple existence of production norms as determined by the state, we can establish from Paris that the workers are exploited and opposed to this exploitation with as much certitude as Leverrier established the existence of Neptune, starting with the perturbations in the trajectory of Uranus. Indeed, the muffled opposition is transformed into open opposition as soon as a crack develops in the shell of totalitarianism, as the latest events in East Germany and Czechoslovakia prove. Let us do some astronomy. Let us assume that there are no hard data on what occurs in Russia. Who does not see that this fact itself, the absence of information, is itself a mine of information? Why should we have no information? Because storms have knocked out communication, or because no one in Paris understands Russian? No. It is because the Russian bureaucracy does not provide any. And why not? For military reasons? But then, why do the United States, France, and England provide such information? And what, from the point of view of military security, would it have to hide? New arms production processes, factory sites, the number of people enlisted in the military service? But we are not asking about that. If worst comes to worst, overall economic potential for coal, steel, oil, and tractor production. But what that kind of stuff is published. Using published data, the American Logistical Services know Russia's present military strength within a range of 5%. What the bureaucracy tries to hide as much as it can is something else. Buying power, income distribution. And those indeed are weapons of war. For in the coming war, with its social and ideological factors, truth from here on out is a weapon, and the fact that the truth is hidden signifies that it is a weapon against the Russian bureaucracy. Otherwise, the latter would use it. Under what conditions would data on buying power and under what conditions would data on buying power and income distribution become a weapon against the regime? If they tended to establish that there was no essential difference between the system of rule and the capitalist system as concerns the working class's situation. Hence, if the bureaucracy keeps silent about these questions, both of the following points have to be true simultaneously. 1. Income distribution inequalities must be comparable to or worse than those existing in capitalist countries. 2. The workers' standard of living must be rising as slowly as it does in the capitalist countries, or even more slowly. If the bureaucracy actually could show that in Russia the distribution of incomes is more egalitarian than in the West, whether the workers' standard of living rises there as rapidly as elsewhere, clearly that would be the only thing we would ever hear talked about from now on. This is not so is proven with room to spare by the line of defense adopted by the most adept cryptos, like Charles Bettelheim. Indeed, such people explicitly admit, as much as a crypto can do, anything explicitly, the enormous inequalities in the distribution of incomes and constant reduction in the working class's standard of living. They then try to, quote, justify, end quote, the situation, starting from the low level of the productive forces in 1913 and from the shortage of skilled staff, which, assuming increasing inequality, must for some unknown reason be growing constantly worse. We have refuted these pitiful sophisms elsewhere. Evidently, Sartre states these sophisms more or less correctly. Quote, the present form of the Russian experience, end quote, is perhaps dictated, he says, by the vital necessity of intensifying production, end quote, of, quote, developing the industry of production, end quote, by the, quote, mortal danger, end quote, that calls for, quote, iron discipline, end quote. When then is it necessary, in order to intensify production or for defensive military purposes, not to limit consumption, but to annihilate the producer's level of consumption, and monstrously raise that of those who parasitically feed upon them? And if the exploitation of man by man is indispensable for the development of production, what becomes of the prospects for socialism? Is it therefore wrong to say that the suppression of exploitation is henceforth the condition for the development of the forces of production, and, quote, for the greatest force of production, the revolutionary class itself, end quote? And what kind of, quote, mortal danger, end quote, starting in 1927, was more pressing than the kind that existed between 1917 and 1921, years of foreign policy intervention and civil war, where democracy in the Soviets and in the Party, for better or for worse, never ceased to function? What kind of bureaucratic cretinism is more economically effective than planning by the masses, who, as Lenin said, quote, alone can truly plan, for they alone are everywhere at once, end quote? If all that means that some combination of concrete and universal factors has led to the installation in power of an exploited class, the bureaucracy, and that by rationalizing history after the fact we explain this installation in power as a necessary phenomenon, fine. But to call what resulted from this, quote, socialism, end quote, or, quote, workers' state, end quote, expresses nothing other than a glorification of a fait accompli, which is typical of the contemporary intellectual. Of course, this story about the would-be missing, quote, data, end quote, is in reality a quaint little joke. Despite what he wants us to believe, Sartre was not born yesterday, and he knows about the data that prove the exploitation of the workers and peasants, for the bureaucracy obviously cannot organize absolute secrecy, nor can it prevent everything that leaks out about this regime from going to establish one and the same signification. He knows very well that the pyramid of incomes in the USSR is extremely high, and that if he lived there he would be a millionaire or purged. He is capable of solving the problem. He is capable of solving the following simple mathematical problem. I have 100 individuals. I take 15 of them and give them each 10 apples. If I give only one apple to each other 85 remaining people, how have I apportioned my apples between the 15 and the 85? And he must have read in Siliga or in Victor Serge, parenthesis, who left Russia only long after the advent of the bureaucracy, end parenthesis, the description of the condition of the working class and that of the working class, or peasant woman, who, having been roused with immense hope during the revolutionary period, has fallen back into age-old servitude and in her life of filth and misery, has no other outlet than to go for, quote, many miles in worn-out shoes in dust, mud, and snow to go kneel and worship at the only church that has not been closed, which is always very remote, terribly remote, end quote. Of course, in the end, the father of the peoples had pity on these poor women. He opened more churches where they could go to learn the good news that if not earth, at least the kingdom of heaven will belong to them, and that in the meantime it is necessary to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to turn one's cheek and then cheek when struck. But all that undoubtedly is concerned, quote, especially, end quote, with the system of religion. Just as Moscow's haute couture exhibitions are concerned, quote, especially, end quote, with the practices of the clothing trade, just as the concentration camps are concerned, quote, especially, end quote, with the penal system, just as censorship and cultural cretinism are concerned, quote, especially, end quote, with the prevailing ideological system, just as the domination and exploitation of the satellite countries are concerned, quote, especially, end quote, with foreign affairs. In short, just as anything in particular is concerned, quote, especially, end quote, with particularity, show us the shameful organicist, the miserable Hegelian, the dirty determinist who would dare claim that everything can be organized around a single idea, a single principle, exploitation and alienation. Show us to him this doubting Thomas, who does not want to believe that all this proves that in Russia they are marching toward communism, even when he is told so.
In his article, Lefort had shown that the proletariat's development can, and from a revolutionary perspective should, be grasped as a history leading towards communism. We have done the same thing in this review ever since the first issue, and this idea seems to be as important as it is difficult to contest. For if there is a connection between the proletariat and communism, one must be able to find it through the various phases of the proletariat's existence in capitalist society. Hence, we should be able to consider the proletariat's development as a history by taking up our position at this viewpoint. This idea profoundly but quite understandably amazes Sartre. The idea that the workers can gripe or kick up a fuss, but are incapable of seizing power themselves and still less of managing society is the thing that is most solidly anchored in the soul of the bourgeois, and which saves him in his own eyes. And the bourgeois is perfectly correct. Till now the workers still have not yet been able to do this. Sartre is bourgeois. He has repeated it often enough. Not, as he believes, because he lives, quote, on the income of capital, end quote. That is just a bourgeois externality, being bourgeois by accident, like being large or small, brown-haired or blonde. Sartre is bourgeois because he has internalized the bourgeoisie, because he chose to be bourgeois. And he chose to be bourgeois on the day he fully adapted, and he chose to be bourgeois the day he fully adopted the conviction that is constitutive of the bourgeoisie, that the workers are incapable of realizing communism. Sartre bemoans their fate like a society lady at a charity ball. Sartre thinks they deserve better, that they even deserve to be in power, but what do you want? The sentiments are beautiful, but nothing can be done. They are not capable of it. Someone should do them some good. If he owned a factory around 1900, Sartre would have been a paternalistic bourgeois. Possessing only the rights of an author in 1953, he will be a Stalinist. These conscious feelings of self-pity for his superiority will furnish him with the gangplank, allowing him to abandon the sinking bourgeois ship for the bureaucratic ship that seems to hold water well. And when he feels stricken with his abject and justified certainty, when Lefort shows him that something else besides defeat's dust and, quote, passion, end quote, can be seen in the history of the proletariat, He will defend himself with irony, mixing together in his confusion quotations from Marx and quotations from Lefort to such an extent that one no longer knows whom he is making fun of. He pokes fun at, quote, class immanentism, end quote, under which is hidden, quote, as in all dialectics, a shameful finalism, end quote. The immanentism in question is roughly speaking, quote, the idea, quote, that in producing capital, the proletariat produces itself as the gravedigger of capitalism, end quote. Quote, the worker produces himself while producing, end quote. All is therefore for the best, Sartre sneers. There is no more reason to complain about exploitation, since it is inseparable from capitalism, which is for him the presupposition of the revolution. Quote, if I were an up-and-coming young employer today, I would be a Lefortist. End quote. And he goes on to tell us that Lefort has invented the monstrous idea, VIZ, that in and through capitalism, the working class grows as a revolutionary class so that he can justify his future anchorage in the intellectual bourgeoisie. It is vain that Lefort is, quote, opaque, end quote. Sartre has, quote, seen through him, end quote, immediately. Now it is our turn to be astonished. Is Sartre himself so unaware? Is what he reads, what he cites of Marx so opaque to him? And if so, why the devil, instead of babbling on about the party, doesn't he spend a month or two attending a training school of some Marxist party? It will teach him in a schematic and clear language, which later on he will be able to render opaque to his heart's content, that capitalism leads to socialism because it simultaneously develops the revolution's, quote, objective conditions, end quote, subjective conditions, end quote, and in particular the proletariat as the revolutionary class. One moment. May I reread that last sentence. It will teach him in a schematic and clear language, which later on he will be able to render opaque to his heart's content, that capitalism leads to socialism because it simultaneously develops the revolution's, quote, objective conditions, end quote, subjective conditions, end quote, and in particular the proletariat as the revolutionary class. And if he thinks he is too old to enroll in a training school, and that he ought to be admitted right now directly into the Central Committee, let him open first to page 763 of Chapter 32 of Volume 1 of the Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling translation of Capital, and learn by heart the following passage. Perhaps what is said there is true, maybe not, but it is the key to understanding Marxism, a theory in vogue these days among some advanced people, and even among some others. Quote, along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital, who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organized, by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated." End quote. And Marx himself cites in a note the following passage from the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The advance of industry whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie places the isolation of the laborers, due to competition, by their revolutionary combination, due to association. What the bourgeoisie produces above all is its own gravediggers. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The proletariat is, parenthesis, modern industry, end parentheses, special and essential product." End quote. Since he cited it, we know that Sartre read the half-page preceding our quotation. In his diagonal reading of Marx, he always falls upon the wrong halves. In any case, now that he can discover Marx's, quote, immanentism, end quote, shameful finalism, end quote, he ought to be able to explain his own position about Marxism and stop bashing us over the head with mutilated quotations from Marx presented as arguments. But if Sartre does not have the courage to explain his own position on Marx, he makes up for it with Engels. It is Engels, he says, who whispers these monstrosities in Lefort's ear. Engels, clandestinely stricken with economism, Engels who no doubt aimed at anchoring himself in the bourgeoisie, but then he already was solidly anchored there. In fact, he spent his whole life at the head of a factory. It became fashionable a few years ago among amateur Marxists and semi-virgins of the, quote, left, end quote, to oppose Engels to Marx. What they found, or what they believe they found, of the mechanistic, of the naturalistic, of the, quote, 19th century, end quote, in Marxism is Engels. Marx, oh no, Marx is just the 1844 manuscripts and nothing else. This attitude expresses both stupidity and cowardice. Everything Engels published during Marx's lifetime was either approved by Marx before publication, including the anti-during, or read by Marx, who never disavowed it. Moreover, what Engels can be reproached for also can be found at Marx. So much for stupidity. I'm going to tell you right now that I'm very interested to hear that, because I did not know that the critique of Engels was even a thing prior to like the late 1960s, 1970s. The big thing that I think about is I suppose, oh, never mind. I wonder who he's referencing here in particular, because I know there was like a certain Catholic or like Christian appropriation of Marx in like the early 1950s that like really emphasized the early philosophical writings from the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, but that kind of like didn't really even touch on or consider the critique of political economy in its developed, mature form at all. So I wonder if that's what he's referencing here, or like who actually Castoriadis is referencing, because this is 1953. So I wonder who these critics of, or these people who drive a distinction between Marx and Engels at this time are. The main people I think of with that are like, at least implicitly, the Frankfurt School, to some extent. So maybe he's talking about them, or maybe, I don't know. I mean, the main people, the most fervent, probably the strongest person to drive a wedge between Marx at like an early stage, at least, maybe between Marx and Engels at an early stage, would be God, what the fuck's his name? Norman Levine. But he wrote a book called The Tragic Deception. It's about Marx's relationship to Engels. But, yeah. And it draws distinctions between them. But I don't think that was published until, like, the mid-70s. Not 1953. So anyway, the cowardice lies in what these gentlemen, who protest all the while that they are not Marxists, do not dare to say, to judge by Sartre's example, do not even dare to think, namely that one is not obliged to accept in block everything Marx might have said or written. Engels' appearance in Sartre's discussion leads to results that are humorous enough for us to devote a few lines to it. The quotation from Engels that is supposed to prove both his own economism and that of Lefort's at the same time says in brief that the mere functioning of the law of value is sufficient to produce capitalism, which has nothing to do with what Lefort says, by near or far. Of course, what Engels says is incorrect, and Marx showed in Capital that although capitalism functions according to the law of value is not sufficient for its creation, that a violent rupture of primitive accumulation is necessary. But Engels' mistake has nothing to do with, quote, economism, end quote, or with the description of exploitation as, quote, a physico-chemical process, end quote. Since for Engels, as for Marx, value quite obviously is a human social relation, just as much as capital is, and not a physico-chemical property of things, and according to Marx, the fundamental relation in capitalist society, the exploitation of labor, is based upon the equality of exchange values. But there is something even more humorous, for this same passage by Engels that now proves his physico-chemical ignominy was cited by Sartre in his first article, prefixing it with a hearty approbation, quote, and then, as Engels has shown quite well, end quote, it is understood that the proletariat has to be deprived of its memory. Why, Sartre, should it be alone in its sad fate? Let us set aside Sartre and his amnesia and come back to serious matters. In the passage cited, Marx described how the process of capital concentration and the numerical growth of the proletariat increased concomitantly. Marx obviously was not being mechanistic. The educational process capitalism subjects the workers to was for him as important as, and even more important than, this numerical growth. An ambiguous and contradictory process, it must be said, for Marx never saw the history of capitalism as an idyllic development of economy and culture that one day perfectly cultivated workers peacefully, or through an instantaneous, quote, revolution, end quote, cracking the shell, come to manage society. Capitalism imposes on the proletariat, quote, misery, oppression, degradation, end quote, at the same time as it, quote, disciplines it, unites it, and organizes it, end quote. The two aspects reciprocally condition each other, and it is the two of them together that are the source of revolution or barbarism. Marx never saw this process of development as a linear ascent. In a passage whose capacity for historical anticipation is almost frightening, he described how proletarian revolutions, quote, interrupt themselves continuously in their own course, recoil ever and anon from the indefinite prodigiousness of their own aims until a situation has been created which makes all turning back impossible, end quote. A century has elapsed since then. What Marx anticipated so brilliantly can now be studied in its actual, but not fully accomplished development, and this actual development has added to the process an element Marx did not take into account, at least not in the way in which it came about, the properly political evolution of the proletariat. The proletariat has created various forms of organization, parties, communes, trade unions, Soviets. It has followed organizations of varying ideologies, specifically Marxist, anarchist, reformist, Leninist, Stalinist. These organizational forms have collapsed or been emptied of their substance. Political parties have disappeared or have committed, quote, betrayal, end quote. All things considered, the history of the labor movement appears first of all as a series of or external or internal defeats? Should not all this put into question the prospect of revolutions? Can we find a meaning or direction for all this? Can we speak of a process of, or of a history, or is it all nothing but accident, error, and delusion, a tale full of sound and fury signifying nothing? One can respond that these defeats are due to a relation of forces between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that so far have been unfavorable. It is, if that is so, why should it be favorable in the future? And how can one not see that this relation of forces in the first place involves the working class? In 1918, the German bourgeoisie did not exist, so to speak. The French bourgeoisie in 1936 was almost nothing. In these two cases, we could cite many others. It is the working class's own parties that have massacred it or stopped it along the way. Why have these parties acted in such a way? To this the Trotskyists respond with two words, betrayal and errors. Childish words, of course. When we then could have a century during which the leaders, the proletariat, gave itself committed betrayals or made mistakes, at least at the decisive moments, the only ones that count. And why would they continually have committed betrayals or made mistakes? Is it a divine curse? And why should this curse be removed in the future? Lenin provided more reliable answers about reformism, and Trotsky did the same for Stalinism. One can say, if one wants, that reformism or Stalinism, quote, makes mistakes, end quote, or, quote, commits betrayals, end quote. But that would be just as shorthand an answer. In reality, reformist or Stalinist politics should be explained by sociological factors. Lenin interprets reformism based upon the labor aristocracy and the political or trade union bureaucracy, combined with the objective possibility of reforms during the time when imperialism enjoyed a period of prosperity. Trotsky explains Stalinist politics as the politics of a bureaucratic stratum that has usurped power in the first worker state. Here we have hold of a solid method of explanation. Indeed, the policies of these organizations certainly have adapted to the interests of the social strata dominating them. These strata themselves correspond to easily describable phenomena and phases of the capitalist economy. The explanation, however, is insufficient. It leaves out the principal interested party, the proletariat. For we are asking not only why reformist or Stalinist leaders adopt the policies they adopt, but also why the proletariat follows these leaders. We cannot say simply that they deceive the proletariat, for one cannot be fooled with nothing, not for long anyhow. And from the practical point of view, we would stumble back onto the same question. Why won't the proletariat be deceived further? Perhaps this is the explanation. The proletariat follows these leaders because up to a certain point and for a certain amount of time it adheres to their policies and their ideology. Why does it adhere to them? Because these policies and ideologies partially express its attitude, because they constitute the proletariat's concrete responses to the situation in which it finds itself, vis-a-vis the bourgeoisie during a given stage, as well as the provisional definitions of its moments in this process of searching for the concrete forms of its emancipation, in which capitalism constantly re-immerses it. Why does it one day stop adhering to these policies and ideologies? Sometimes because all struggles become impossible and simply stop, most often because the concrete situation has changed or because the previous ideological formula has been outstripped, or both at once. But can we speak of, quote, moments in a process of searching and of, quote, outstripping, end quote, when we refer to the proletariat? Are we not the victims of language? Does not this process of searching, this outstripping, presuppose a subject in the proper sense of this term? Does not such a subject refer to logical structures and uniform criteria? Does it not persist through time, and is it not therefore endowed with, quote, memory, end quote? The answer might appear paradoxical. It is, in fact, banal. Because the proletariat is objective, it is a possible subject. We have already seen that the unity of the proletariat as a subject, as an experience, and as a criterion is posited first by the objective conditions of capitalism, and then by the workers' reaction against these conditions. Likewise, the unity of the history of the proletariat as a series of significations finds an objective expression in current social reality. The proletariat has no need to recall previous struggles, for the results of these struggles are there, already incorporated in its present situation. The results of its past activity have become an integral part of its current experience, perceptible in the present with no need to have recourse to reflection on the past. In this sense, each great action by the proletariat tends to outstrip the preceding ones because it contains them in its current object, social reality, which itself has been fashioned by previous struggles. The proletariat has no need of memory to draw the lesson that comes out of the failure of reformism. It has this lesson there before it. Here is what capitalism can furnish through some through some peaceful reforms. Here is the measly 5% more that it still might eventually furnish. In order to arrive at the distinction between property forms and the actual relations of production, the understanding of the kind of exploitation found in bureaucratically administered statification, and in order to reject the vision of party dictatorship as a dictatorship over the proletariat rather than of the proletariat, the Russian proletariat does not need to relive the history of the degeneration of the October Revolution and to read Trotsky or even Socialisme ou Barbarie. Higher forms of class consciousness are potentially there before it, as the negative side of its past action. They necessarily will become explicit the day it takes up the struggle again. Each party expresses a given moment of its existence, a necessary stage in the proletariat's development. It is worth the trouble to add that it does not at all follow from this fact that you always have to support the strongest, quote, working class, end quote, party in the country in which you happen to find yourself. Only someone with the soul of a lackey or a parliamentarian would draw such a conclusion. Before closing, let us give Sartre the floor one more time. All this is arbitrary, he says. It's just your interpretation, your opinion, and if you find a meaning in the history of the proletariat, it's because you started off by deciding that there was one. You reconstruct the history of the proletariat like a dialectic, and you forget that the truth of a dialectical movement is proved either because one is in praxis or because one finds oneself placed at the end of history. All this is indeed our opinion. What else is there? That it is not arbitrary results from the fact that it is one of the two possible opinions. The others, yours or that of Camus, that of Malenkov or of McCarthy, consist in not finding a meaning in the history of the proletariat, because you have started off by deciding that there cannot be one. We reconstruct the history of the proletariat like a dialectic, because it is the only way to understand something or to do something. And your dilemma about praxis and the end of history proves once again that you do not know what you are talking about. For to be in praxis means precisely to posit the end of history, of this history here, as a project of action, and starting from a possible meaning contained in the present, to maintain a practical perspective that in turn illuminates this meaning. However, that may be, henceforth it is not with Sartre, but only about Sartre that we can now debate. And there's no postface. So, bye.